Most people assume that narcissists move on easily, finding someone new, repeating the same patterns, and never looking back. What almost no one realizes is that there is one specific kind of loss that stays with a narcissist in ways that new supply, new relationships, and new performances of moving on can never fully quiet. There is a category of loss that the narcissist's behavioral system was not designed to process, not because it involves deeper feeling than other losses, but because it produces a specific operational problem that the usual recovery mechanisms cannot resolve. The person who couldn't be replaced. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's internal assessment of people is not primarily emotional. It is functional. People are evaluated automatically, continuously, and beneath the level of conscious awareness, according to what they provide, how consistently they provide it, and how difficult it would be to find an equivalent provider elsewhere. Most supply sources assessed by this system are ultimately interchangeable. Different surface presentations, different names, different histories, but functionally equivalent in what they deliver and how reliably they can be conditioned to deliver it. The person the narcissist couldn't replace was different, not because the narcissist recognized their worth as a human being, but because the specific combination of supply characteristics they provided, the particular quality of their emotional attunement, the specific ways they had been conditioned to respond, and the depth of engagement they offered created a supply environment that subsequent relationships kept failing to recreate. Pay attention to what this produces in the narcissist's internal world, because it is not grief in any form most people would recognize. It is a persistent dissatisfaction, a background awareness, operating beneath every new relationship's idealization phase, that what is currently available does not match what was previously accessible. The ghost of optimal supply doesn't haunt the narcissist with emotion. It haunts them with comparison. Every new person who enters their life gets evaluated against an invisible standard they cannot see and were never told existed. This is where the haunting begins. Not at the moment of loss, but in the accumulating realization across subsequent relationships that the loss produced a deficit the available supply market cannot fill. Most people miss this warning sign entirely, because the narcissist's public behavior after the loss communicates the opposite of haunting. New relationships arrive quickly. New performances of thriving follow immediately. The surface presentation suggests someone who moved on with remarkable ease. The hidden reason this performance is so complete is that it was never designed to communicate truth. It was designed to communicate distance from need. And the need it was designed to conceal is precisely the one that won't resolve. There is a specific category of psychological disturbance that the narcissist carries after losing someone irreplaceable that operates differently from the supply deficit, quieter, more persistent, and rooted in something that new relationships cannot address, because the problem it represents has nothing to do with what new relationships can provide. The unfinished control loop. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's ability to process the ending of a relationship, to file it to narrative, manage it, to incorporate it into the self-story in a form stable enough to move forward from without ongoing disruption, depends on a specific condition being met. The narcissist needs to have participated in how it ended, not necessarily to have initiated the ending, not necessarily to have wanted it, but to have been present in it as an active party whose responses, whose tactics, whose final manipulation attempts shaped the ending's form. When someone simply leaves, cleanly, completely, without the dramatic final confrontation that gives the narcissist material to work with, the ending doesn't get processed. It gets stored as an open loop in a psychological system that requires closed loops to function without interference. Pay attention to what an unfinished control loop does to the narcissist's ongoing experience, because it doesn't simply sit quietly as an unresolved memory. It actively interferes. It surfaces in the middle of new relationships as a background restlessness that the new supply can temporarily quiet, but never eliminate. It generates the monitoring behavior, the periodic checking, the occasional reaching out that persists years after any reasonable expectation of re-engagement should have expired. The loop is not looking for the person. It is looking for the closure it was denied. And the specific cruelty of this particular haunting is that the only source of that closure is the one person who has permanently declined to provide it. This is where the witness self problem compounds everything else. Because somewhere in the world, a person exists who holds an accurate account of who the narcissist actually is. Not the persona, not the curated presentation, not the version of themselves the narcissist manages for every other audience, but the real, unfiltered, privately revealed version that only emerges in relationships intimate enough to penetrate the performance. Most people miss this warning sign because it doesn't produce visible behavior in the way that other forms of narcissistic disturbance do. It produces vigilance, the quiet, persistent monitoring of what that witness might be saying, to whom and with what level of detail, that operates continuously beneath the surface of the narcissist's public confidence. The hidden reason this vigilance never fully terminates is that the narcissist cannot manage a narrative they no longer have access to. And an unmanaged narrative, in the hands of someone with first-hand knowledge, represents a permanent and irresolvable threat to the image management that is always the narcissist's primary operational concern. There is something that happens inside every relationship the narcissist enters after losing someone they couldn't replace. Something that begins almost immediately, operates without conscious intention, and produces a specific and recurring dissatisfaction that the idealization phase of each new relationship temporarily masks but never eliminates. The comparison begins. What most people don't realize is that this comparison is not a deliberate act of nostalgia or a conscious choice to evaluate new partners against an old standard. It is automatic, the output of a supply assessment system that learned, through extended exposure to an exceptional supply environment, what optimal provision actually felt like. And now that system, encountering new supply sources, keeps running its evaluations against a calibration point. It cannot reset. The new person's emotional responsiveness gets measured against the lost one's depth. Their tolerance gets compared to a tolerance that was built through years of conditioning. Their specific ways of providing attention, engagement, and supply get evaluated against the particular configuration that previous conditioning produced. A configuration so specific, so precisely fitted to the narcissist's requirements, that encountering it in a person who hasn't been through the same conditioning process is essentially impossible. Pay attention to what this produces in the narcissist's behavior toward new partners, because the dissatisfaction it generates doesn't stay internal. It surfaces as escalating demands, as accelerated devaluation, as an impatience with the conditioning process that the narcissist's previous relationship had already completed. New partners get pushed harder, faster toward responses they haven't yet been shaped to provide. And when they can't provide them, the narcissist experiences a frustration that has nothing to do with the new person and everything to do with the absence of someone who was already there. Most people miss this warning sign because the new relationship looks from the outside like all the others. This is where the reverse conditioning effect reveals its most significant consequence. The narcissist, having lost the product of years of conditioning, begins attempting to recreate that product in new relationships, deploying the same tactics, the same pressure sequences, the same systematic erosion of boundaries and self-trust that produced the conditioning in the previous relationship. But the hidden reason this never produces the same result is not that the tactics have changed. It is that the process takes time, real time, measured in months and years of sustained exposure. And the narcissist who lost an irreplaceable person is not operating with patience. They are operating with a deficit they can feel and a comparison point they cannot escape, which means the conditioning process in every new relationship is being rushed by an urgency that the process itself cannot accommodate. The result is relationships that cycle faster, devalue sooner, and consistently fail to produce the supply quality that the lost relationship slowly, through sustained conditioning, once provided. There is a recognition that surfaces in the narcissist's psychology after losing someone irreplaceable that is more threatening to their internal stability than any of the operational deficits already examined, because it points not at the loss but at the mechanism that produced it. And the mechanism is the one thing the narcissist's entire behavioral architecture was constructed to keep permanently outside the field of conscious awareness, their own pattern. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist pattern, the idealization, the conditioning, the devaluation, the discard, or the driving away, is not experienced from the inside as a pattern at all. It is experienced as a series of relationships, specific responses to relationship, specific circumstances. This person required this approach. That relationship ended for those reasons. Each cycle is processed as its own contained event, rather than as one instance of a repeating behavioral sequence. This processing requires something to sustain it, and what sustains it primarily is the continuous availability of new supply. New relationships provide new circumstances that can absorb new explanations. The pattern stays invisible as long as the progression from one relationship to the next maintains enough speed and enough narrative variation to prevent the underlying structure from becoming visible through repetition. The loss of someone irreplaceable disrupts this mechanism, because the failure of subsequent relationships to match the previous supply quality slows the progression, creating gaps between relationships or long stretches within relationships where the dissatisfaction cannot be managed through the usual escalation and replacement cycle. And in those gaps, something becomes possible that the speed of the normal cycle prevents. The pattern becomes visible. Not fully, not with the clarity that outside observation might produce, but with enough consistency across enough failed replacements that the narcissist's internal narrative begins encountering a question it cannot fully absorb into the usual framework. Why does this keep happening? Pay attention to what this question does to the narcissist's behavioral system, because it is not a question the system was designed to sit with. It produces immediate defensive responses, new explanations for why each specific relationship failed that locate the cause in the specific partner, the specific circumstances, the specific incompatibilities of each individual situation. The pattern level question gets fragmented back into situation level answers as quickly as the system can generate them. But the question keeps returning, particularly in the quiet moments that insufficient external noise occasionally creates. Particularly when a new relationship fails in a way that maps too precisely onto the previous failure to be explained by circumstances alone. This is where the specific memory intrusions become the most psychologically significant element of the haunting, because they arrive precisely in these moments of pattern proximity, and they carry a specific quality that the narcissist's usual narrative management cannot successfully process. Most people miss this warning sign because it produces no visible external behavior. It is entirely internal. Moments of unbidden recollection that resist the reframing the narcissist applies to the relationship's general history. A specific conversation where genuine understanding passed between two people. A particular moment of being truly known rather than simply observed. An instance of connection so specific in its detail that it cannot be generalized into the supply. Focused framework the narcissist uses to categorize relationship memories without losing the quality that makes it intrusive. These memories are not haunting the narcissist with love. They are haunting them with contrast. The contrast between what was present in those specific moments and what is consistently absent from every relationship entered since. The hidden reason these memory intrusions resist narrative revision is structural. The narcissist's revision process works by recategorizing memories, moving them from the column of genuine experience into the column of tactical exchange, from the category of real connection into the category of supply interaction. Most relationship memories can be successfully revised through this process, but certain memories resist it. The ones specific enough, genuine enough, and rare enough that recategorizing them would require the narcissist to acknowledge something about the difference between what they experienced then and what they are capable of experiencing now. And that acknowledgement is the one the entire behavioral architecture was always most fundamentally designed to prevent. There is a behavior that persists in the narcissist long after every visible sign of the relationship's ending has been publicly performed and apparently concluded. A behavior so quiet, so consistent, and so entirely disconnected from any rational expectation of outcome that its persistence reveals something about the haunting that no other behavioral signal communicates as clearly. The monitoring never stops. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's continued surveillance of someone they lost and couldn't replace is not driven by hope in any conscious sense. It is driven by the unfinished loop, the open control sequence that the clean exit created and that the narcissist system keeps returning to with the automatic persistence of a process that was never given a termination command. The checking is not strategic. It produces no actionable intelligence that the narcissist deploys toward a specific objective. It simply continues, a background process running beneath the conscious activity of new relationships, new supply sources, new performances of having moved on entirely, checking periodically and without apparent purpose whether the status of the lost supply source has changed. Pay attention to what this persistence reveals about the haunting's true nature, because it exposes something that neither the operational deficit nor the unfinished loop fully captures. The narcissist's internal world, beneath all the supply management and narrative control and persona maintenance, contains something that the loss of this specific person made impossible to permanently silence. An awareness of absence, not of the person specifically, but of what the person's presence provided, that nothing currently available replicates. This is where the haunting as self-exposure reaches its most significant dimension, because what the persistence of the monitoring reveals, what the comparison that won't resolve, and the memory intrusions that resist revision, and the surveillance that never terminates all point toward together, is something about the narcissist's internal world that the persona's entire function was designed to keep hidden. Most people never realize that the haunting was never really about the person they lost. It was about what losing that person made it impossible to keep avoiding. The encounter with an interior emptiness that optimal supply was always, temporarily and incompletely, filling. When you examine the complete architecture of what haunts a narcissist after losing someone they couldn't replace, the irreplaceability recognition that produced a supply deficit no subsequent relationship resolved, the ghost of optimal supply that became the invisible benchmark against which every new person was measured and found wanting, the unfinished control loop that kept returning to an exit. It was never given the tools to close, the witnessed self that created a permanently unmanageable narrative in the hands of someone no longer under their influence. The comparison that ran automatically through every subsequent relationship, the reverse conditioning that kept failing. To recreate what years of patient conditioning had originally produced, the pattern visibility that the slowed replacement cycle occasionally forced into uncomfortable proximity. The specific memory intrusions that resisted the narrative revision applied to everything else, the monitoring that never received a termination command, and the self-exposure that the haunting's persistence ultimately produced. What emerges is a portrait of a psychological consequence that the narcissist's entire behavioral system was never designed to survive intact. Not because the loss was felt deeply in any human sense, but because it created conditions the system had no protocol for resolving. What most people don't realize is that the haunting was never about love. It was about function, about the specific operational gap that an irreplaceable supply source leaves behind. A gap that new supply circles around without filling, that new performances of indifference cannot close, and that the monitoring behavior keeps returning to with the persistence of a system that was built to extract and was never taught to accept that some losses simply cannot be recovered from through the usual means. The person they lost didn't haunt them by leaving something behind. They haunted them by taking something with them that the narcissist's internal world had no other source for. And in every quiet moment since beneath every new relationship, every new performance, every new supply arrangement, that absence keeps making itself known. Not loudly, not dramatically, just persistently, the way only the irreplaceable can.